What is up, you guys? Welcome to another edition of the Fundamental Health Podcast. This is one I have been looking forward to for a long time. This is a podcast with Joe Whittaker about testosterone and all of the important nutrients found in animal foods that help us make this super important hormone. For men, there will be no strangers to the importance of testosterone, but women may not understand the fact that testosterone is important for women's libido, women's body composition, all sorts of important things for women's health as well. We break it all down in this podcast. And I am super excited to announce that at Heart and Soil, we have just released Whole Package, which is our sort of male hormone optimization formula with testicle, liver, and blood. It has the most testicle of any desiccated organ supplement on the market, and you can get it at heartandsoil.co. I don't know if you guys have ever eaten testicles, but I can tell you anecdotally, when I eat bull testicles, when I get them from White Oak or another farm, they feel good when you eat them. And I think you guys will really appreciate this Whole Package supplement. And it's not just for guys either. I think women can get benefits from eating testicle containing supplements as well, like Whole Package. So check it out, heartandsoil.co. I am super excited about this one. And I know that it is going to benefit so many in the community with regard to overall nutrients, and just all the good stuff that's found in organs in general. As I do on these podcasts, I wanted to read you guys a review because I'm so stoked about what we do here. And this one is about Firestarter. This is from Michael D. He says, I was stuck at a weight for quite a while. I added the Firestarter without changing anything else. And before the week was over, the fat started coming off again. I'm sold. Plus, the entire ordering process was great. Thank you. How cool is that, you guys? Obviously not a controlled experiment, but he says he doesn't change anything. He adds Firestarter, weight starts coming off. If you understand the chemistry around stearic acid, if you've heard the podcast that I've done on stearic acid in the past, this will make sense to you. Stearic acid is a long chain saturated fatty acid found in animal fat primarily that turns on your mitochondria and turns on fat burning. Obviously, that's high level, but I've talked about it a ton in the past. We make both of these supplements at Heart and Soil. Combining Firestarter with Whole Package would be an amazing combination and increase the absorption of all the fat-soluble nutrients in Whole Package. So go to heartandsoil.co. I built this company because I wanted to help you reclaim your birthright to radical health. I have an amazing tribe here that will help you with things. I'm so proud of what we all do. I'm so proud of my tribe here, and I'm so excited about what we'll do in the future. Heartandsoil.co. All right. Like I said in the beginning, Joe Whittaker, master's level scientist in the UK, doing all sorts of analyses, looking at animal-based nutrients and the importance of these nutrients in making testosterone. You guys are going to love this podcast. Joe and I are going to do it part 2 because he's got more research in the works, but this is going to blow your mind in terms of all the unique nutrients that are beneficial. This podcast came out of an article of his that I posted and talked about in a controversial thoughts video. You can find that one in the past on my library of controversial thoughts videos. That one's about testosterone. And if you want to find my controversial thoughts videos about stearic acid, you can find all those in the history of my podcast, which is obviously called Fundamental Health, because you're here. So enjoy this podcast with Joe Whittaker. If you like this podcast, if you like what I do at Fundamental Health, please leave me a review wherever you listen to podcasts, but especially Apple Podcasts, because that helps us reach more people. And as a thank you to all of you guys and girls who are going to leave a review every month, I'm going to give away a signed copy of my book to one person who leaves a review on Apple Podcasts. So thank you in advance, and enjoy this one with Joe Whittaker. Joe, thanks for not coming on the podcast, my friend. I think this topic is going to pique a lot of interest in my audience.
Thanks for having me on, man. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm always excited when I get to have anybody on the podcast with an accent. So I think that's another bonus. So that's like the cherry. That's the cherry on top for everyone. But I first became aware of your work. I think one of my followers sent me a recent paper that you'd done, a meta-analysis looking at low-fat diets and testosterone in men. And I was like, this is really interesting stuff, obviously, because I'm interested in eating animals and animal fat, animal organs, and I'm a man, so I care about testosterone, and even women should care about testosterone. But this idea of connections between dietary strategies, especially low-fat diets, and testosterone was fascinating. And you reached out after I did a controversial thoughts video about that paper, and I was like, oh yeah, let's definitely dig more into this. So Why don't let's start out with, I'm sure most people listening to this have some sense of the importance of testosterone, but give us your sense of this. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background, what you're doing over there in the UK, and then let's get into testosterone and why the heck we care about this.
Yeah, sure, man. My background, I'm a clinical nutritionist at the minute. I did that paper I did mainly at the University of Worcester, and now I'm kind of doing further research into the kind of testosterone niche because, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's definitely a hot topic on the internet. I would say for guys, it's like second to muscle mass in terms of popularity. Testosterone, it has the classic roles of supporting reproductive health and supporting male development. So in the fetus, it's the synthesis of testosterone that like primes the development of the primary sex characteristics, as we call it, which is the male reproductive organs. And then as you go through into puberty, you get more androgenic influence from testosterone, which increases what's called the secondary sex characteristics, which are the typical masculine characteristics of facial hair, which we've both got, body hair, deepening of the voice, increased muscle mass, things like that. And then, you know, it continues to support those kind of roles in adulthood. But I mean, probably the most obvious other benefit of testosterone, having optimal levels of testosterone, is athletic performance. So most people are aware it's super important for strength, muscle building, things like that. You know, of course, there's a reason why bodybuilders inject testosterone because it's so potent in protein synthesis. But maybe a lesser known effect is that it actually increases endurance. Testosterone increases the production of red blood cells, and of course red blood cells distribute the oxygen to the muscles, increase ATP, decrease lactic acid, things like that. And cyclists, they're pretty well known to use testosterone because cyclists are almost like the master dopers of the of the athletic world. I don't want to give them a kind of bad name, but I know it's pretty prevalent. There was a recent case here actually in the UK where the British cycling team doctor, it was about 10 years ago, but it's only recently just come out. And the British cycling team, for anybody who might not know, they won a lot of Olympic gold medals. Like they had a real big surge in success, and the Tour de France, things like that. And the doctor was found to have ordered some testosterone, and his kind of his fallback was always for this guy's erectile dysfunction. But you know, most people can put one on one together, and it doesn't equal potato. It equals two. But I'm not suggesting they're all on testosterone, right? But I'm just kind of illustrating the point that it's very potent. And then I'd say the last thing, well, not the last thing, but the last broad area that testosterone is super important is its links with disease. So low testosterone is linked with a lot of different diseases, and whether it's cause and effect, you know, or a mixture of both, probably the latter. But it's linked to low testosterone linked to Alzheimer's, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and it's more than just a link because you see these big causal associations in meta-analyses, things like that. But you can show the causal effect of testosterone by giving synthetic testosterone replacement therapy. So, for instance, when they give diabetic men who have low testosterone, when they give them testosterone replacement, their insulin sensitivity is at least in part restored. You know, the fasting glucose, fasting insulin comes down, HbA1c, things of that nature, and it has like maybe the strongest links with disease is the metabolic health, because of its kind of roles in protein synthesis and in body fat distribution. There's a few interesting studies in mice that essentially when they knock out their androgen receptors and essentially so they're kind of inculcated against the effects of testosterone, they essentially get skinny fat, so they get abdominal obesity, but they lose weight overall and they lose muscle mass. So you can kind of see a trend there in humans as well, with men with low testosterone. They get the kind of classic dad bod, which is the spare tire around the middle, a reduced muscle mass. And normally it goes along with kind of low motivation, things like that. Testosterone is important. So, I mean, that's the kind of broad overview without going into kind of every nitty-gritty area.
And I know testosterone also has implications for mental health. There's connections with depression and mood disorders and all kinds of things. And let's just reemphasize that testosterone is important for both men and women, that many times replacing the androgens for women improves sex drive and all these other things. Obviously, women don't need to have as high a level of testosterone as a male, but testosterone and hormonal balance is important for both men and women. And so the implications of what we'll talk about today are certainly relevant for both men and women. The other thing I want to mention here is that I think that because of what I've done in the past, clinical work with clients and patients, there's a lot of people that I've met and worked with who have been told by their doctor that they have low testosterone and they're put on to testosterone replacement synthetically, either as injections or other creams, almost as a knee-jerk reaction. And this is the kind of thing that I rebel against in my work, and that I appreciate so much about the work that you're doing, because both of these have the intention of really asking the question, what the heck is causing low testosterone in the first place? Which is really what we're going to dig into in today's podcast, and asking the question, is it possible that something about this man, usually this man's lifestyle, whether it's sleep disturbance or stress or absence of animal fats in the diet or animal proteins in the diet or animal organs in the diet, as we might find out today, that could be contributing to low testosterone in a number of ways. And I think that's a microcosm of the type of work that I want to continue to do in the future, because I hope that Western medicine begins to ask those questions, right? And begins to say to men, well, you have a low testosterone. Why is that? What are you eating? How are you living your life? Are you eating a low-fat vegan diet, which might be contributing in some way to that problematic thing? So that's why it's so important. And I think before we move into the next part of the podcast, I have to ask you this really, really important question, which is, do you tan your balls in the sun?
No, not currently, but I know there's some guys out there who do that.
I don't know why. Why don't you do that, man? Anyway, I don't know if it raises testosterone, but I have seen some evidence, and I'll try and put something in the show notes, that ultraviolet light exposure on the skin can improve testosterone. And I think in this old study, they suggested that maybe ultraviolet light exposure on the genitals could improve it. So I'm in Costa Rica. There's a lot of sun here. I can neither confirm nor deny that I sometimes tan naked here. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, it explains all those kind of nudist beaches in Europe.
Oh, it feels good, right?
Yeah, just hanging out there.
Yeah, literally, yeah. So another point that I know we should talk about before we go much further is, in medical school, in the United States, and I imagine in the UK, we are sort of inculcated with these insidious notions that I think are wrong. One of them is that systolic blood pressure rises with age, and another of them is that hormones decline as we age. So what are your thoughts about the notion that testosterone is supposed to decline as we age as males?
Yeah, that's a great point, mate. Just one thing on the last thing. At the University of Worcester, they've got a big nutrition department, and they're like super into the functional medicine stuff. So it's kind of embedded within my academic brain to think more root cause rather than the kind of traditional medical plaster. But to your latter point, I mean, to be honest, I don't think it should decline. I don't think there's much evidence for that. It's a fairly outdated view. If you look at, there's been a few studies in hunter-gatherers and other isolated populations measuring their testosterone levels. They normally do saliva, just because it's easier out there. And definitely in the hunter-gatherers, it doesn't seem like there's any decline. I know there's small samples, but you would at least expect to see a trend, which they don't. And then in the other isolated populations, which they might not be on the kind of optimal paleo diet, but they're pastoralists or they're just kind of farmers who are isolated from the ills of modern civilization. In those, they tend to either not find a decline or a much reduced rate of decline, so something a half to a third. And then, I mean, even if you put that aside, the kind of isolated case study kind of stuff, or isolated groups, in the current medical literature, it's not really supported. The thing that really solidified this in my mind, it was when I was doing this paper actually. There was a meta-analysis I came across, 2014 I think, and they said the reason for doing it, they were like, well, some studies show testosterone declines with age, some don't, so we're going to resolve the conflict. And they found from 20 to 40, there was a slight decline, like something like 10%. But after that, there was no consistent decline. But interestingly, they found increased variability, which, suggests it's environmental factors that are causing some men to get a sharp decrease in testosterone. So, I mean, in summary, to answer your question, there may be a slight decline, maybe 10% or something over age. But if it's like going off a cliff, I'd say that's physiologically abnormal.
And yet, very commonplace. So there's this adage I've heard, I think from the Weston A. Price Foundation. One of my friends said, I heard this saying on the Weston A. Price Foundation, just because something is common doesn't mean that it's, quote, normal. And I love that.
Yeah.
I think it's just because the majority of humans develop heart disease doesn't mean that heart disease is normal. Just because the majority of human males have declining testosterone in Western civilization doesn't mean that that's normal. Just because the majority of humans on the planet have increased levels of systolic blood pressure as we age doesn't mean that it's normal. So I really like that, and that's a really interesting data point to consider as we move forward in this discussion, that in hunter-gatherer populations, we don't necessarily see a trend. We can't do an N of 30,000 because there's not that many hunter-gatherers left on the planet, but it would be an interesting study to do in the Hadza, and I had previously interviewed Herman Ponser, who spent a lot of time with the Hadza, and talked to him about many of these things. I don't think he specifically looked at male hormone levels in the Hadza, other than to note that their testosterone is lower, but I think it probably is stable. And in that conversation, the takeaway was that their testosterone is probably a little lower because they're doing so much physical activity. People can refer back to that previous podcast if you're interested in the constrained energy model. Nevertheless, even at that slightly lower testosterone level, the Hadza remain a very virile people, especially the males are not lacking in virility. But I think that this is an important point to emphasize, because so often this is the narrative that plays out in doctors' offices across the United States and throughout the world, saying, well, you're getting older. Doc, I'm 35 years old. Or doc, I'm 45 years old. Or doc, I'm 55 years old. Well, you're getting older, your testosterone is dropping, therefore we should give you a testicular cream or an injection. And there's never any appreciation. So it's awesome to hear at the University of Worcester that there's a functional medicine sort of root cause model is built in there, because I've seen this a lot, that testosterone levels are variable and will respond to lifestyle changes. Now, the other thing I'll just mention is that I have a number of clients who are in their late 60s, early 70s, who have testosterone levels that are very robust, 600, 700 total testosterone. And one of them, who I'll give a shout out to, not by name, but he says, I'm the high testosterone dentist, Paul. And I said, yeah, I guess you are. He likes to refer to himself as the high testosterone dentist, because I think he's nearly 70 and his testosterone is 700 or 800. So clinically, anecdotally, I would agree with you that I don't think testosterone has to decline as we age. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was to let males and the women that love them and women who are dealing with low testosterone know that lifestyle factors play a huge role here. So do you want to start talking? Let's dig into this meta-analysis that you did. I can bring it up on the screen. We can dig into it. But how did you get interested in this, and what did it find? And maybe just give us a little bit of background about what a meta-analysis is, just so that everybody knows.
Yeah. So a meta-analysis is just, you do a systematic review, which you pick a topic and you try to search the literature for every single study on that topic, and then you synthesize the findings in a kind of statistical model, and that's your meta-analysis, and it pumps out one figure. So maybe you've got 10 studies, 2 say yes, 8 say no. You compile them all and you get an overall no. I can't remember what I said there. That's the essence, because each individual studies, just by natural variation and chance, will throw up conflicting results occasionally. So the meta-analyses are seen as a kind of definitive way to answer these questions. Although I will say although they're a very useful tool, that they do have drawbacks in terms of you can only answer like one very specific question, whereas something like a narrative review, you can do something broader. It was when I was at uni, I saw it online, because in like nutrition, I don't know if you've come across this, like the nutritionists in the UK, there's like 95% women, so there's like almost nobody who studies male health. I think all my lecturers were women. I think there was just me and one other guy in the cohort who were guys. But anyway, I saw people online speculating whether dietary fat had anything to do with testosterone, and there are various arguments, like some people say it lowers it, some people say it's a myth, and so on and so forth. I thought, I love online speculation and all that kind of stuff, but I thought maybe the guys are just cherry picking some studies, to support their side of the argument, whatever. So I realised there was a need for something comprehensive, and when you look in the literature, there was some isolated studies, but there was no review on it, basically. So I thought, let's do one. And initially, I thought to the review, I will look at all the observational studies and all the interventional studies. But when I looked at the observational studies, which is obviously a lesser quality of evidence, the results were just like flying in 10 different directions. And it just seems to didn't seem to make any sense at all. And because there's so many things that affect any health parameter, but testosterone, at least I know there's a lot of things that affect it. So there was like a lot of confounding variables, and I thought, let's just jump these, because these are clearly not a decent way to study this. And so I just focused on the cream of the crop, like the intervention studies, and we were very rigorous. We selected the best ones out there, so they didn't have confounding variables like the guys were on medication or they had diseases, things like that. And we did the meta-analysis, about 6 studies. We split one into 2, so it was like 7 samples, roughly 200 guys. And the studies largely, they put men first on a high-fat diet, about 40% fat, and then they put them on a low-fat diet, about 20% fat. And some studies did it vice versa and mixed it up. But they found when the guys transferred from the high-fat diet to the low-fat diet, their testosterone decreased by about 11.5% on average. I think you can see in the paper it's in standardized mean differences, which are like 0.38 or something. They're a bit funny, those, because they're measured in standard deviations. But anyway, it averages out to about 11%. But then we saw, it's a little bit of a sketchy conclusion, but we did a subgroup analysis where we took one study out that was an outlier, probably for ethnicity, and we just focused on the ones that are the Western men of European descent, so it was ethnically homogeneous, and that had a larger decrease in testosterone. That was 15%, and when I did like a little press release and to get some press coverage on the thing, and I didn't really emphasize this in the paper, but I thought, oh, the press are going to like this kind of little juicy tidbit. I thought, what about the vegetarian diets? Because I saw that two of them were the two studies that had vegetarian diets. Like the testosterone kind of fell off a cliff, to be honest. And I just calculated a little kind of back of the envelope. Well, it's a bit more than back of the envelope calculation. But they suffered a 26% decrease in testosterone. So the low-fat vegetarian diets were like, pretty bad. 26% decrease in academics is a very large effect. And it was funny because the UK media, I don't know if it's the same case in the US, but there's a lot of tabloids here, and they ran all these stories like low-fat diets like decrease your libido by like 50% and all this kind of crazy stuff, which was stretching the truth a bit, but I was appreciative of it.
The one time you liked what the UK Daily Mail was saying. There are so many tabloids there, man. It's crazy. So yeah, why don't you, I guess I'll pull the paper back up. We can walk through it a little bit. We can show people the forest plots and then maybe get into a little bit more of the analysis from this one, because there were some other observations that you had. So I showed the abstract, the conclusion, low-fat diets appear to decrease testosterone levels in men. And you talked about the studies and how you included them. People watching on YouTube can see the 7 studies that were selected for the inclusion in the meta-analysis here. You have the risk of bias in the studies here and the length of the studies, which ranged in length from 2 to 10 weeks for the low-fat diets. And as you mentioned, not all of the studies were vegetarian. 2 of the 7 were vegetarian low-fat, and the rest of them, I guess, were omnivorous low-fat. But people watching this on YouTube, walk us through the forest plot here. This is the total testosterone forest plot showing the standardized mean difference for the low-fat and the high-fat diets. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, so you can see all the studies on the left are the ones decreasing testosterone, those little green dots. And then you can see one didn't have much of an effect and one had like seemingly the reverse effect. But when you look at the other hormones, it doesn't really indicate the reverse. It's a bit complex, but that's the kind of overview. And you can see the one on the bottom and the one kind of fourth, I think they're the 2 low-fat vegetarian diets. So I saw that controversial thoughts video, and in comparison to the UK tabloids, as much as I love them, that was like kind of PhD level analysis, and it was actually really good. I was thinking, man, Saladino should have been a peer reviewer on this paper, because you brought up some points that I didn't emphasize that much in the paper, but then I started thinking about afterwards. And I went on a kind of little research binge and thought, yeah, there's definitely something more to this, and particularly around the low-fat vegetarian diets, because there were a couple of studies where they basically said to the guys, just eat a normal diet, just have lean meat, and then increase your carbs a little to compensate, and then the standard diet was fatty meat. And those studies showed about 15% decrease. So it seems like you get about a 15% decrease in testosterone if you cut animal fat specifically. But those diets, they still had the meat, even though it was lean. But the ones the 2 vegetarian low-fat studies, they of course cut not only the animal fat, but the actual meat, and meat is a very rich source of micronutrients, some of which, are unique to animal products. And they suffered an additional 10% decrease. So it seems like, you get an additional 10% decrease for the micronutrients. And I can start going into the mechanisms if you want. On animal fat and the animal-based nutrients.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because when I wrote the paper, I was big on I thought mainly it was due to the fat in the diet, besides those kind of outliers. And the reason for that was there there were like several other studies we didn't include that were a bit less quality, and they showed similar effects with reducing the fat, and specifically the high fat diets were higher in monounsaturated fat and saturated fat, you know, which are of course prevalent in animal foods, and the low fat diets cut those fats, but they tended not to cut polyunsaturated fat, and in some cases they actually increased it. So it suggested that the mono and saturated fat, the animal fats, they had some kind of protective effect on testosterone, whereas the polyunsaturated fats seem to have an adverse effect. And probably some of the audience probably already shouting out the answer here. But so there are a couple of studies, you know, that were fairly similar to support that theory. But the one that really was kind of the nail in the coffin for this is there was this animal study, and these guys, I think they were Spanish researchers, and they put mice on either an olive oil based diet, a coconut oil based diet, soybean oil, or grapeseed oil. So you got the monounsaturated fat, saturated fat diets, and then the polyunsaturated fat. And because you can do all sorts of crazy things with animals you can't do in humans, you can get like a real in-depth view on what's going on. And you can see one of the papers there published on that study. And they found that the olive oil and coconut oil diets, they had like great testosterone levels, but the polyunsaturated fat diets, they analysed the testosterone like in the testes, in the gonads, and they found it had halved, which is absurd that you can get such a change just from kind of changing the oil in the engine. And then, of course, they can analyse even further, and this is why I really like those studies, because they really dug down into what was going on, and they found whatever fat you ate, those fats ended up on the cell membranes of the Liedl cells, and the Liedl cells are the cells in the testes that produce testosterone. And you know, nutrition research is known for a long time that what fats you eat end up in the cell membranes of the cells, but I don't think anybody knew that it went all the way to the testes, or at least they didn't think that was some kind of major thing. And because these polyunsaturated fats, they're very prone to oxidation, because they've got more double bonds, so on and so forth. You see the markers of oxidative stress in those mice, they like quadruple, you know, quite literally. So the oxidative stress goes like off the scale, and that seems to like start damaging the Liedl cells because they stop synthesizing as much testosterone. Free cholesterol levels, for some reason, they kind of go down as well. And then, you know, applying this to humans, we looked at kind of analogous studies in humans, and you can see in humans that what you obviously can't see the facts in the testes of men, because, you know, for one, ethics, and for two, you know, maybe no researcher wants that job. But you can see them in the adipose tissue and the blood and stuff like that, and you can see that the polyunsaturated fats end up there and start causing oxidative stress. Similar kind of mechanisms. So that, I mean, I did a lot of kind of post hoc thought on this after the study, after saw that video you put out. So I think the fat, the polyunsaturated fat, that kind of theory, I think that probably accounts for like about 15% of the decline, you know, something like that. And then I'm rambling away for a long time, but I can go into the kind of animal-based micronutrient side of it if you want.
Yeah, before we do that, I want to show people a few things here. So just so everybody understands what we're talking about with the Sertoli cells and the Leydig cells. If you look at testicular anatomy, you can see that in the seminiferous tubules in the testicle, there are multiple different types of cells. There's a Leydig cell out here. There's a Sertoli cell over here, and here are the spermatogonia. These are where the sperm are made. And as Joe is suggesting, the Leydig cells and the Sertoli cells work in concert to really produce testosterone, which is a part of the formation of these cells. And so isn't it interesting that in this paper, as you're suggesting, they found that the cell membrane composition of these Leydig cells was affected by the composition of the diets? I mean, no big surprise there, but this is later on in the first paper that I showed on the screen in YouTube. In the study, we demonstrated that commercial oils added to diets were able to affect lipid composition of interstitial cells, mainly Leydig cells, and that they markedly influenced their androgen biosynthesis capacity. So that's fascinating. That's fascinating that, as you said, monounsaturated fats, which is essentially usually oleic acid, and saturated fats found in coconut oil did not have this effect on the Leydig cells, but higher polyunsaturated fatty oils grapeseed or soybean, which have, I believe, 55 and 65% linoleic acid respectively, significantly affected the composition of the Leydig cell membranes and appeared to affect then the levels of free cholesterol, which is obviously a precursor for the formation of testosterone. If listeners are familiar with the biosynthesis pathway for hormones, you'll know that cholesterol is a precursor. Cholesterol is needed to make sex hormones, whether they're progesterone or estrogen or androstenedione or whatever, or testosterone. These all come from cholesterol, including things like aldosterone and other hormones. So when you're affecting all these things with the fats you're eating, it gives you a putative mechanism by which the Leydig cells may be affected negatively by these polyunsaturated fats. So that's intriguing. And there were actually two papers you sent me. I can bring up the other one just so everybody can see it, because these are such striking papers, and I want to make sure that we get them into the show notes. But they were pretty interesting and pretty striking. So the second paper is Dietary Lipids Modify Redox Homeostasis and Steroidogenic Status in Rat Testes. The underlying question remains, are rat testicles the same as human testicles? No, but I don't see a compelling reason why it wouldn't act this way. But as you said, the redox homeostasis, which is the balance of oxidation and reduction with these fats, is important. So they say here in the paper, the oxidative stress in the testes was higher with the grapeseed oil supplemented diet and decreased with the other diets in this order: soybean oil, then olive oil, and then coconut oil, which follows exactly the degree of unsaturation in these oil molecules. As you were saying, the more double bonds in these molecules, the more oxidative stress they appeared to create in the testicular membrane. So this concept that the oils we eat end up in our cell membranes and can affect us is pretty profound. And yet, I mean, were you taught this in your nutrition training? Maybe at the University of Worcester, because there's a functional medicine component.
No. I mean, yeah. The lecturers and stuff are aware of oxidative stress, polyunsaturated fats, but probably not to this extent. I mean, you really have to kind of dig down to literature to find some of these things. I mean, that was kind of baffled me that nobody had really heavily cited these papers, because they had some correlations in those papers. I think it was free cholesterol levels and testicular testosterone, and they were like 99% correlations, which is like absurd. So that was another reason why I thought those results were so strong.
I think that this is the graph that you're referring to. I'll pull it up.
I think it's right at the bottom of one of the papers.
So these are the graphs, right?
Yeah, those are them. So you can just see it just perfectly lines up.
The R squared is 0.99 and 0.98 in terms of testosterone and either free cholesterol or cholesterol ester. And the correlation here. So what do you think is going on here? Walk us through this, and then.
There was a kind of little bit of a black hole there in terms of the paper. It looked like the oxidative stress was going off the scale, and for some reason that was making the free cholesterol kind of dissipate. And as I said, there wasn't. They didn't they didn't provide a clear kind of step-by-step of why that was happening. They just kind of said it was happening. I mean, I just thought it was probably just some adverse effects of oxidative stress, just causing things to go haywire without knowing the nitty-gritty of it.
It seems possible, and I think, what's so funny is sometimes when I'm going down these rabbit holes myself, I find other papers and I think, oh, cool, I found another little, it's like I'm walking on a beach and I found this like pearl or this nugget or this piece of gold. So I bumped into this paper. I don't know if you've seen this one, which is another interesting one. Anything that is involving polyunsaturated fats in humans versus saturated fats is fascinating to me. But the title of this paper is The Effect of Increased Intakes of Polyunsaturated Fatty Acids and Vitamin E on DNA Damage in Human Lymphocytes. And what they found was that the increased amount, this study indicates that increasing dietary levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids to 15% may adversely affect the indices of DNA stability. So here's another paper that kind of corroborates that. Now, notably, they said, however, increasing the dietary intake of vitamin E by 80 milligrams per day ameliorated the damaging effects of PUFA. But how many people who are consuming polyunsaturated fatty acids in their diet are even doing so knowingly? And how many of those people who are eating these polyunsaturated fatty acids in ultra-processed foods are going to be aware of supplementing with the proper ratios of alpha, gamma, or beta tocopherols? It doesn't make any sense, right? And this is one of the problems with these industrially manufactured seed oils, is that the vitamin A the vitamin E that is present in these oils in like a nut or a seed is often removed. It's significantly lower after the bleaching and all of these deodorization processes of these oils. So you end up with vitamin E removed from these oils. And I just found that interesting, that there seems to be multiple lines of evidence now that increasing the amount of polyunsaturated fat in your diet leads to changing of your cell membranes. And this leads to problematic consequences for many humans, unless they are going to extremely great lengths to protect their membranes from that. And that may not be a great thing. The other thing I'll say, as I ramble a bit here, is that this has implications for many things, including LDL levels in the human body. So I've spoken a little bit about this paper in the past, but I thought it would be germane to mention it now, this idea of the homeoviscous model of lipids in the cell membranes affecting cardiovascular disease risk and cholesterol levels. And so this is a fascinating paper that people can hear me discuss on another Controversial Thoughts episode that I've previously done, but it speaks to your same point, Joe, that these researchers from, I believe, Sweden hypothesized in an issue, in an article published in February of 2021, that saturated fat, though it appears to raise LDL cholesterol, may not be doing this in a pathological manner, which is something that I've believed for many, many years. But that, in fact, this may be due to sort of what they call the homeoviscous model of adaptation to dietary lipids in the cell membranes. And that, simply stated, is that as we consume more saturated fats, these become incorporated into our membranes. And in order to keep the membrane at a certain constant level of fluidity, the body may increase LDL levels and thus cholesterol into the membranes. And so, as they say here, accordingly, an saturated fatty acid-induced raise in LDL cholesterol in healthy individuals could represent a normal rather than a pathological response. These regulatory mechanisms may become disrupted secondarily to pathogenic processes in association with insulin resistance and the presence of other ASCVD, atherosclerotic coronary vascular disease risk factors. So that's an interesting idea, I think, while we're talking about the way that membranes change. Now, you mentioned something to me in our email correspondence prior to this. In the studies that you found looking at these low-fat diets and testosterone, wasn't there also a signal for insulin resistance?
Yeah, I mean, insulin resistance is heavily tied to low T. I mean, looking at the literature, the way I always thought about that link was insulin resistance may induce low T, or maybe a bidirectional relationship. It's something I considered as an explanation, but just on the limited data of those studies, I didn't think it was, because the the guys on the low-fat diets, they lost a slight bit of weight, so it suggests that insulin sensitivity wasn't majorly changed. But I mean, in a kind of, obviously in the real world, restoring insulin sensitivity is probably going to have a very beneficial effect on testosterone levels. I mean, I'm doing some research at the minute that I can't kind of reveal the streets, reveal the secrets, but it's kind of looking in that direction to see if a diet that restores insulin sensitivity is going to have a beneficial effect on the androgens. So yeah, I mean, I agree. There's definitely something there.
It's a fascinating connection. All right, you want to tell us, what are your thoughts about these animal-based micronutrients? And this is a topic that I love because I'm fascinated by micronutrients, not the macronutrients, not fat, carbohydrates, and protein, but the micronutrients, things like zinc and manganese and selenium and peptides and fatty acids like stearic acid, and these micronutrients that are unique in animal organs especially, but also in animal meat. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, the obvious connection for the low-fat vegetarian diets was zinc was probably going to be lower. Zinc is pretty well known zinc deficiency is pretty well known to induce testosterone deficiency or low testosterone. So that was an obvious thing. And in the general population, red meat and poultry, they're the main sources of bioavailable zinc. And vegetarians fairly consistently have lower levels of zinc in the plasma and in their diets as well. But then, I mean, then I did start thinking more, because there are other micronutrients found in animal foods that have very plausible roles for supporting testosterone. Retinol, or vitamin A, preformed vitamin A, is retinoic acid, which is a metabolite of vitamin A. It's shown in vitro to induce testosterone secretion by the Liedl cell. So basically they're kind of dripping some retinol on Liedl cells in a test tube or something. And there's not much studies in the way of supplementing vitamin A with humans, but there was one that was really striking. I first heard about it, Chris Masterjohn, I think he did a lecture on vitamin A and testosterone or something like that. And anyway, he cited this study and I looked at it further. And they got two groups of boys that had delayed puberty. And the one group of boys, they gave them testosterone replacement therapy, which is known to induce puberty. But the other group, they gave them retinol and iron. So they're both, highly bioavailable micronutrients in animal foods. And the ones getting the supplements, they were able to induce puberty in them as well as the testosterone replacement therapy, which is like pretty remarkable that just a couple of vitamins have as potent effect as an actual synthetic hormone. And I probably won't get too much depth on all of them, just because I don't want to bore stiff the audience. But I mean, the others like carnitine, there's a fair few studies showing carnitine, which red meat is like, arguably the only kind of meaningful source of carnitine. I found 3 studies fairly easily that show carnitine supplementation increased T. And I mean, you'll probably like this one, Paul, is that there was one study and they took a little biopsy of muscle and they found when they supplemented with carnitine, the androgen receptor density went up, which it gives a much more nuanced picture because, perhaps, in some cases testosterone is high or it goes low, but you don't know what's going on with the receptor density that's going to play an important role. And then the others, CLA, arachidonic acid, they've got links to testosterone, all found in animal foods, and cholesterol as well. There's a bit of conflicting evidence, but I think it might play a role in why we see in these studies the low-fat vegetarian diets being kind of so severe for testosterone because they're missing a lot of these supporting nutrients. And last thing is, you made a good point in that other video that these nutrients, nature designs them to come together. It doesn't design them in a little supplement, and so the biochemistry and the biochemical pathways may synergistically work together when you eat a piece of meat rather than take a retinol pill, take a carnitine supplement, so on and so forth. So yeah, which is why you may see in vitro the effects, but perhaps some of the supplement studies don't pan out.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. I was researching vitamin A, recently, and zinc deficiency is connected with all sorts of increased levels of vitamin A toxicity because vitamin A synthesis is at every step zinc dependent. And so is it possible that people taking vitamin A supplements could have a pre-existing zinc deficiency? Absolutely, because if you're not eating vitamin A in liver, which is high in zinc, or getting your liver with muscle meat like what you would when you were eating a full animal, you certainly could develop a zinc deficiency. For instance, if you were a vegetarian or a plant-based leaning dieter who is taking a retinol palmitate supplement but not eating a lot of zinc-containing, at least bioavailable zinc-containing foods. And so I love this concept of sort of the holistic view of human nutrition from an evolutionary anthropology lens, because it makes me think, oh yeah, of course, it's so simple. If we just eat the foods that humans have always been eating, we find all of these nutrients co-occurring that have these synergistic functions. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so interested in organ meats and all of the synergistic ways that the micronutrients work in concert with those. So yeah, thank you for that. That's fascinating with carnitine and that study of the prepubertal boys. If you can send me that one after the podcast, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. The other thing that I've found interesting in terms of animal fat and animal nutrients is stearic acid. I've shared this study before, but it's such a cool study that I'll just share it one more time. And this is actually a study done in humans, and they put the humans on a vegan diet, which was stearic acid deficient because it doesn't have any of this animal fat. For those that don't know, stearic acid is an 18-carbon saturated fat. And then they reintroduced stearic acid back into their diets. And what they found was that when they say, we show here that C18, which is stearic acid ingestion, rapidly and robustly causes mitochondrial fusion in people within 3 hours of ingestion. Stearic acid intake also causes a drop in circulating long-chain acylcarnitines, suggesting increased fatty acid beta oxidation in vivo. Basically what that means is when they took people and they put them on a animal fat deficient diet, they obviously were not measuring testosterone in this study, but they were measuring mitochondrial activity. When they put them on an animal fat deficient diet, the mitochondria were separated, and they were not doing beta oxidation. They were not burning fat. They were not using fat to make ketones or to make energy. When they gave them stearic acid, the mitochondria all fused together. They basically became active with this animal fat signal. So this is a fascinating paper, and it was a paper that I spoke about a lot when we released our Firestarter supplement at Heart and Soil, because there is a lot of stearic acid in animal tallow. And you can see in the paper here just that you can see that there were fragmented, intermediate, and then fused mitochondria when they gave people back stearic acid. So yet another animal-based nutrient that is missing when you're on a low-fat diet. And that's not even to consider things like odd-chain fatty acids and so many other things. So that is just such a fascinating set of, just a fascinating rabbit hole to go down, thinking about how these nutrients affect us as humans.
Definitely. I mean, I would say with the vitamin A, a point I missed is that the reason why preformed vitamin A is so important for at least some people is they lack kind of enzymatic efficiency to convert beta carotene into retinol, which is the active form. So I think the studies estimate about 30 to 40%, something like that, of people really can't convert beta carotene in any meaningful amount. So for those people, it's essential they get the preformed vitamin A, which is only found in animal foods, and Normally in the ones people don't eat that much in the West, like liver. I know it's found a bit in eggs, oily fish, things like that.
Yeah, the BCMO polymorphisms are very common. And I remember when I was writing my book, The Carnivore Code, I came across a study that suggested that the rate of conversion, even in those who can use the BCMO enzyme to cleave beta carotene into retinoic acid or retinoic acid precursors, the rate of conversion is anywhere from 3 to 28 times slower than preformed vitamin A, suggesting that you need 3 to 28 times more beta carotene to get your equivalent dose of active retinol or retinoic acid, retinol palmitate as a human being. And we know that human beings have a dietary requirement for preformed vitamin A, or at least retinol palmitate, retinoic acid, et cetera. And so the statistic that I came across was striking, and it was that if you wanted to get your vitamin A, quote, from plants, if you were part of the 60 to 70% of the population that could actually convert beta carotene to bioavailable vitamin A, and you ate the plant food that was the richest in beta carotene, which is sweet potatoes, you would sometimes have to eat close to a pound of sweet potatoes per day to get the equivalent of the RDA for bioavailable, quote, preformed vitamin A. And I thought, well, isn't that striking? So yeah, and interesting that you could take prepubertal boys with delayed, these were boys with delayed puberty, and give them preformed vitamin A and see that things started to turn on. That's a scary thought, thinking that maybe these vegetarian diets are creating vitamin A deficiency at a clinical or a subclinical level in people who are going predominantly plant-based.
I mean, anecdotally, a couple of years ago, I got pretty bad dry eye. I went to an ophthalmologist and an optometrist, all the eye doctors, and credit to one of them, they did actually give me a multivitamin, which is at least a step in the right direction. Apparently, there's some researcher up in Scotland who's heavily into nutrients and their effects on tear production. But it really wasn't until I first started supplementing with vitamin A and then I started incorporating liver. It really wasn't until I did that it actually cleared up completely. And if I stop having vitamin A rich foods for a week, it starts to come back. So that kind of converted me onto the liver. I did.
How much liver are you eating per week, do you think?
It's probably just once a week. I mean, it's in mackerel and salmon as well, so I eat that as well in lesser amounts. And then, occasionally I take a supplement as well for it.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's another really, really important question. Do they serve testicles in the UK? Have you ever eaten testicles?
Probably someone up in Scotland. It's deep frying testicles, but it's not a commonplace one.
They're delicious. I'll tell you, they're delicious, man. It's actually one of my favorite things here in the States is to eat bull testicles. Sometimes White Oak Pastures has them, but they're pretty rare. We're actually pretty excited at Heart and Soil to be releasing a supplement with testicles in it, and I think it's fascinating to think about all the little micronutrients that are going to the testicles, right? And that are concentrated in there, and then you're getting them when you're eating testicles. I think of them as they're one of the more rare, precious foods out there, but I'm surprised, man. Well, if you ever come to the US, I'll try and get some raw testicles or some desiccated testicles for us to eat.
Yeah, I'll be game. I mean, we should do a case study on you. Before and after the testicles measure too.
I think we should. Let's do it, man. Pilot study.
Poof.
Yeah, I don't think we'd have any trouble recruiting people into that study. We need 10 men who are going to eat some cow testicles, and we're going to check your testosterone to see how much it goes up. So it would be pretty cool to see. Yeah, it would be fascinating. So I think that the broader points here are pretty important for men and women to appreciate. That, I mean, what are the dietary guidelines and trends in the UK? Because here in the United States, animal products are vilified, right? And I've spoken out repeatedly and said that I hope that the Biden administration defends beef. I'm a little bit apprehensive about that based on things that Kamala Harris said prior to the election. But are meat and organs something that is appreciated in the UK, or is there a similar sentiment sort of moving away from these things? And do you think there's any connection between that and the general decline in men's testosterone levels currently and over the last few decades?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, to put it briefly, the UK is pretty much the same as the US. Dietary guidelines are the same, fairly similar culture, although in the UK everything's a bit smaller, in the US everything's bigger. But yeah, we've got the same kind of trends, really. I mean, the vegan society, I believe they actually started in the UK about 100 years ago. I mean, I think, and I haven't delved too much into this, but I think that pre-dietary guidelines and the lipid hypothesis, all that kind of stuff that went on in the 50s, before that, I really think that animal foods were viewed as a very nourishing food, you know, and rightfully so, because we've got the modern science to back it up now. And I really see that post-Second World War, with the government and the dietary guidelines, is causing a major shift away from animal foods. I mean, there's many tales. Well, I mean, to put it simply, like the nobility throughout the ages, throughout medieval ages, throughout ancient Greece, they always had the animal foods, and they also liked a lot of fruit as well and sweet things. Whereas, you know, what do you give to the peasants? You give them the grains, the beans. Those were the lesser foods. And there's actually a phrase in the UK. People say, "Are you doing porridge?" Which means, are you doing time in prison? Because they feed them religiously. They feed them porridge, you know, because it's a low quality food. It's cheap. There's actually like a famous TV show. It's called Porridge, when the guys are in prison and stuff. And then there's quite a few other little kind of anecdotes about animal foods, meat, and masculinity, and there's definitely a cultural association people have, and it still remains to this day, even with the kind of vegan, kind of vegetarian nonsense out there. But in terms of kind of getting to the kind of science and stuff like that, starting in the 1970s, there's data that shows very clearly that testosterone started to decline at a rate of like 1% a year. And that's adjusted for the increase in obesity. So the real rate is probably like 1.5%. And it starts in the 70s, not because it started in the 70s, it's just because that's when the first data is. You know, this decline might have been going on for a long time. But 1% a year is a lot. You know, from the 1970s to now, that's 50% decline. And it mirrors, I'm sure you're probably already aware of this, but it mirrors the decline in sperm counts, which the data for sperm counts actually goes back to the 30s, and they can see a decline, you know, roughly the same, like 1 to 2% a year, all the way from the 30s until present day. And with testosterone as well, it's less well established, but there's a clear trend, and it goes up. Like the last study was published last year showing this decline, so it's continuing. And what's almost scarier is that these studies, it's just like a straight linear decline, and there's no sign of it leveling off. So I'm assuming at some point in time it's going to hit zero, which might be like physiologically impossible. But you know, even in the journals, they say, you know, there's no sign of it leveling off. It's going to be a major problem. And the change in diet in the after the government guidelines, and probably before that, to be honest, shift away from animal foods, animal-based nutrients. I think that's probably had a key role, or at least a role of some sorts, in these declines in male reproductive health. I mean, we talked about the meta-analysis and all the kind of mechanistic data. That I won't go into too much detail, but there's quite a few epidemiological studies that show that higher intakes of red meat are protective for sperm. So we know there's a link there as well. You know, probably due to the same kind of micronutrients we talked about. So, we've got this overall general decline in reproductive health. It's obviously it's not isolated. It's part of the larger decline in health that's going on in our societies, like the rise in autoimmune diseases, which are skyrocketing, and the thing that kind of connects a good connection between these two. The last thing I'll say on this is, I'm sure you're aware, and many of your listeners are aware, of the study Pottinger's cats, which just briefly, it was a pioneering study done in the 40s, where this guy Francis Pottinger took hundreds of cats. He fed some cats the optimal diet, some cats a less optimal diet, and he bred them for subsequent generations. He found the cats on the less optimal diet, when they started to get similar health problems to humans, like cardiovascular disease, arthritis, autoimmune diseases. But interestingly, for my niche, the cats on the poorer quality diets, they started to have severe reproductive problems, and indicative that their reproductive organs and the sex hormones are going all over the place. And particularly, if you look, I was reading it last night, just because it's a fascinating little book, and he notes that the male cats become docile and passive, which is like a clear sign that their testosterone has gone down. And I don't know how they did this back in the 40s, but he says that they had no sperm. Like, which I don't know if he's overstating the case. Maybe it's just like it's so low that that it's not coming up. But he specifically says that, and previous researchers have postulated that the ones on the cats on the more deficient diets, that they were lacking essential nutrients, and so we can kind of draw a parallel to humans and our society, with our diets are far from optimal at the minute. They're lacking essential nutrients that previously we would have got in abundance, and that is probably a very strong causal reason for these declines in health, in wider health and reproductive health as well.
Well said, man. It's super scary, but the good news is I think there is a way forward. I don't know if you've seen this study, but since we're talking about sperm counts, this is one of my favorite ones ever. They looked at food intake and sperm characteristics in a, quote, blue zone. This is Loma Linda, the, quote, blue zone in Southern California, where there's Loma Linda University and a Seventh-day Adventist community. And to the point of what you and I have been talking about for this entire podcast, they looked at the sperm motility, they looked at sperm counts in non-vegetarians, lacto-ovo vegetarians, and they found that, I'll read the conclusion here, the study showed that the vegetables-based food intake decreased sperm quality. In particular, a reduction in sperm quality in male factor patients would be clinically significant and would require further review. Furthermore, inadequate sperm hyperactivation, which is sort of like motility, in vegans suggested compromised membrane calcium selective channels. Doesn't sound very blue to me. Doesn't sound like a good blue zone. The results say lacto-ovo vegetarians had lower sperm concentration versus non-vegetarians. Total motility was lower in the lacto-ovo and vegan groups versus non-vegetarians. Vegans had the lowest hyperactive motility, and then sperm strict morphologies were similar for the three groups. So there you go. Not only are we with this study calling into question the notion of blue zones, but we are really pointing a finger toward this idea of both the importance of animal foods in the diet and the potential downsides of constructing the majority of your diet free from animal foods. People have hypothesized multiple things about the results of this study. This is not the only study to show that consumption of vegetables correlates positively with decreased sperm quality, and so others have hypothesized this may also be due to pesticides or other contaminants that may be on the vegetables. Regardless, we see a clear pattern that moving away from animal foods toward higher amounts of plant foods is probably bad for sperm quality and reasonably by proxy for testosterone production as well. So, yeah, what a rousing conclusion that is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as I mentioned, there's a few studies that show a protective effect or suggest a protective effect of animal foods, and maybe those vegetables are displacing, more nutritious foods. There's maybe like one kind of last little bombshell I can drop, is that, and again, like people in these spheres are going to be familiar with this type of argument, but polyunsaturated fats have like, especially like soybean oils, things like that, have gone from being nothing in the diet from 100 years ago to being like a massive portion of people's diet. And in contrast, animal fats, and if you look at the data, particularly like lard and butter, they've really decreased. So you see a replacement in people's diets. They're replacing the animal fats, the traditional animal fats, with polyunsaturated fats like soybean oil. And taking this into account with those mice studies we were talking about earlier with the polyunsaturated fats going around the renal cells, I mean, plausibly, that's one of the main reasons we're seeing these declining levels of male reproductive health, is that people having excessive polyunsaturated fats, particularly linoleic acid, the predominant omega-6 fatty acid, and this is causing oxidative stress, perhaps among other deleterious effects, contributing to these large declines we see, in male reproductive health and in wider general health. There is some evidence to suggest omega-3 fatty acids are beneficial for testosterone. So we might have evolved to have a protective response of this, from omega-3 fatty acids.
Interesting. If people are curious about omega-3 fatty acids on an animal-based diet, I've done a controversial thoughts video about that in the past. I've tested my omega-3 fatty acids on a diet of just animal fats without even egg yolks in my diet, and they were pretty robust. So that's a very interesting topic as well. I personally am not convinced that we need to eat a lot of fish to get adequate omega-3s. There's an interesting concept that the desaturases and elongases are shared between the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid metabolic pathways, and that if you eat an evolutionarily appropriate amount of omega-6, that would be a low amount of omega-6, your body's pretty darn good at converting things like alpha-linolenic acid, which is actually found in animal fat, into EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, docosahexaenoic acid, docosapentaenoic acid, etc. And it's my belief that there's plenty of these omega-3 fatty acids in well-raised ruminant animal fat. Again, the magical substance with stearic acid and all these other micronutrients. So yet another reason that removing animal fats from the diet could be problematic unless you're getting some source of bioavailable omega-3s. I don't think we need a ton of omega-3, and I do have concerns about over supplementation with omega-3, but certainly a moderate amount that's found in animal fats is probably really beneficial for humans. So, well, man, thanks for coming on the podcast, Joe. Where can people find more of your work or reach out to you if they want to connect and eat some testicles with you?
Well, I don't know about the last part, but you can go to my website, joewhitakernutrition.com, and check out the paper. And I'm due to publish another one in about winter, which would be a little bit of a big splash that I'm sure some of your audience will be interested in. So keep an eye out for that, basically.
Awesome. And one of the last things that I always ask people, if I remember on the podcast, is what is the most radical thing that you have done recently? And in the US, the word radical means like cool or exciting or new or challenging. So,
man, I don't know. I mean, I've done a lot of radical things in my life, but not recently.
Well, COVID in the UK may have curtailed that. You can expand the event horizon to whatever degree you'd like.
I mean, I'll say the most radical thing, this is quite tame, is I have broken the lockdown rules on more than one occasion.
I appreciate it. What have you done when you've broken the lockdown rules? Can you tell us?
Well, Last year, I had a girlfriend, and she lived down like in London, which is a bit of a drive. And when nature calls, you have to answer basically. Lockdown or no lockdown. So that, but I'll say that was in limited circumstances, and I don't blanketly advise people to break the lockdown. I don't know what your thoughts are on COVID, but I mean, I'm a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of that whole thing.
Well, I just want to point out how much I appreciate the fact that this whole conversation has been about healthy testosterone levels, and you breaking the lockdown is an indication of your healthy testosterone levels with a healthy male libido, which is a thing to be celebrated in humans, and a healthy female libido. So I've talked about my views on COVID multiple times in the past, but the short answer is that I think that it's a virus. It exists. It's harming some people, but generally people who are metabolically healthy, and I believe eating an evolutionarily consistent diet will be just fine. I've had it. The symptoms were very mild, and I think that the response has been misguided and generally politicized, like so many other issues, and that has led us to make many missteps and often over constrain the population and make very silly decisions. When we are told to stay out of doors, when we are told to stay indoors, and there's very clear knowledge that vitamin D and ultraviolet light are beneficial for our immune systems, there's a discordance there, and it doesn't make any sense. And when they close beaches in California and they close outdoor spaces, it's just ridiculous. So anyway, a lot of frustration about how the whole thing has been handled. But thanks again for coming on, man, and I look forward to the next bombshell paper that you will drop later this year.
Thanks for having me on, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure.